Crimson Frontier. Dust and ambition. The stars don't twinkle out here, they burn. Cold and distant, they mock the tiny lives that struggle beneath their indifference. Humanity's reach had stretched toward them for generations, first as a whisper of hope, then a scream of desperation. When Earth began to buckle under its own weight, riddled with overpopulation and the poison of its excess, humanity turned its eyes to the stars. The moon was first, its barren surface carved into domes and tunnels, a stopgap for those with the means to escape. But Mars was the jewel, the prize for those with ambition and greed enough to stake a claim. Mars wasn't a land of promise, it was a crucible, a place that burned away weakness and left behind only those too stubborn to die. They called it the New Frontier, but it wasn't new. It was old and cruel, older than the hands of those who clawed its surface, and it belonged to Helion Industries. Victor Helion didn't just own the land, he owned the air, the water, and the tools you used to survive. He wasn't merely a man anymore. Years ago, he had taken the boldest step in his rise to power, a leap into immortality. When his body began to falter, he turned to the very technology that had built his empire. Using his company's Cognilink-inspired advancements, Helion had his brain and head fused into one of his own Ethereum-grade android bodies. Now, his voice carried the synthetic edge of a machine, his movements seamless and coldly precise. His ambition had transcended flesh, and his presence loomed larger than life. Terraformers that choked Mars' skies into something almost breathable, Helion built. Androids that mined the red sands with tireless precision, Helion designed. The ships that carried men and women to their new lives on the frontier, Helion made. And the rules they lived by, his. Caleb Rourke knew all of this before his boots ever touched Martian dirt. He had learned it back on Earth, at the sprawling Helion-run spaceport in Texas. The place was a relic of NASA's old glories, its faded logos still clinging to cracked walls beneath the new banners of Helion Industries. They didn't even bother scraping the past away completely. The remnants served as a reminder of what had been lost. Space wasn't about exploration anymore. It was about survival and profit. Caleb had boarded his first transport at that spaceport, a Helion shuttle that ferried him to Luna Terminal on the moon. Luna wasn't a colony. It was a staging ground, a glimmering hive of corporate ambition and cold efficiency. Every corridor buzzed with activity, engineers perfecting machines, miners prepping for their next assignments, settlers clutching papers that declared debts they'd never escape. Caleb had walked those halls and seen the faces of men and women who'd gambled their lives on a promise sold by Helion. Most of them wouldn't last a year. The second transport had been worse. Packed into the belly of a Helion freighter, Caleb had shared the air with dozens of others, their hopes thick enough to choke on. The engines thrummed with the promise of Mars, but Caleb knew better than to believe in promises. Mars wasn't a place where hope grew. It was a place where it died, buried under red dust and regret. When the freighter finally broke through the thin veil of Mars' atmosphere, it shuddered as if the planet itself resented its arrival. Caleb sat still, his hands wrapped around the frayed armrests of his seat. The landing was rough, a screech of hydraulics and the groan of stressed metal, and then, finally, the hiss of the airlock opening. The first breath always hit like a punch. The air was thin, dry, and tasted faintly of iron and ozone. Terraformers had done their work, but it wasn't enough. It was never enough. Most newcomers needed breathers to acclimate, but Caleb didn't. He'd spent years under weak skies, working in places where survival meant adapting. Mars's air wasn't kind, but it wouldn't kill him. The settlement loomed ahead, a crooked collection of prefab structures and scavenged metal. Antennas swayed lazily in the wind, and generators hummed in the distance. Redhaven, they called it, a name meant to inspire, though it carried the weight of irony for those who understood what waited here. This wasn't a haven. It was a trial, a place where the strong preyed on the weak and the weak became fertilizer for the next dreamer's ambition. Caleb stepped off the ramp, his boots crunching into the red dirt. The dust clung to him immediately, settling into the cracks of his boots and the folds of his coat. He didn't look back at the ship, didn't watch as it sealed itself and prepared to launch back to Luna for the next load of settlers. There was nothing behind him worth remembering, and ahead of him, that remained to be seen. Red Haven greeted him the way it greeted everyone, with silence, dust, and the faint hum of desperation in the air. Mars had no welcome mat. It only had a question. Are you strong enough to stay?